Maco here, who's our next speaker.
Joe Maco.
I have my glasses on, excuse me. But in the meantime, I really have to thank everyone for trying to pitch in and help. You know, for example, Brian Rogers, he got up and he moved the shade down a little bit so that we all help a little bit. And this fellow's gonna take some video. So we appreciate all that. And we try to do the best we can to get some speakers here. Anyone who has any ideas about speakers in the future, fine. Let us know and we'll see if we can work on that. All right, so about containerization. When I first heard that word, I was wondering what the heck is he going to talk about? But
And some of you probably already know me. My name is Joe Maco. I went to sea for, well, 10 years as a ship's officer and 41 years as a pilot here in Long Island Sound. I've given presentations about piloting in Long Island Sound. I asked Russ if you get short on speakers, you know, I'm always can help out. I actually gave this presentation a number of years ago for the Shoreline Men Over 60 in Madison. They meet once a month. And I didn't get through the whole thing because at the time I gave the presentation, there was an incident called the Casca Concordia. It's a big cruise ship off of Italy that sank. So I gave more information probably on that than I did on this presentation. And I called in Naval War College up in Newport and I started getting presentations. I asked him if he had any videos or anything. He said, just go on YouTube, it's all on YouTube. So I apologize for some of the commercials that might pop up before we get the YouTube presentation because they want their 6 or 7 seconds, whatever they get out of YouTube for paying to have YouTube present something. And anyway, one of the reasons I'm talking about this is my career as a deck cadet started in 1963, and you'll see as we show some of the videos that basically containerization was just in its infancy. So I grew up, so to speak, in the maritime industry with the beginning of containerization and basically watched the whole thing explode until it got to where it is today. So I can give you a first-hand accounting of some of the things that happened in the transition from what we call break bulk cargo, where everything was handed almost piece by piece. In fact, it still is in a sense today until it gets in the container. But so I have this first video. This is, as I said earlier, I believe we can get it going. Okay, so that gives you a little synopsis of what happened. In 1956, Malcolm McLean.
Car shopping? Try CarGurus. CarGurus. It's easy to find the cars you like and compare deals. Every car is rated from great deal to overpriced.
So Malcolm McLean had this idea and he fulfilled it in 1956. And you probably remember back when Sealand was the company you would see their trucks on the highway. And without too much more, I'm going to get into who Malcolm McLean was. Most people don't know who Malcolm McLean was, probably never heard the name, but we'll find out shortly.
Everything is everywhere these days. Check out the supermarket. Orange juice from China, milk from India, swordfish from Japan, lager from Czechoslovakia, scores examples of European cheeses, you name it, it's there. Not when I was growing up. You'd never taste the range of French cheeses or Bohemian lager beers.
That came from the monitor.
It basically couldn't unless you were very rich and could go anywhere when the fancy took you. All that has changed. But it's not just
By far the cheapest. There are no roads to build or intersections to stop at, and once a ship starts moving, it requires very little attention. Some of the biggest container ships in the world are manned by just 13 crew members, and companies like Rolls-Royce are developing self-driving versions as we speak. The problem, until recently, was moving cargo onto and off of the ship, which often took even more time than actually sailing. That's because workers had to lift, carry, and drag everything from barrels to crates and heavy bags. Not so fun, and not very fast. A journey from New York to Europe, for example, might only take 12 days, but loading and unloading would take another 7. That's 7 full days it could have spent delivering more cargo. Therefore, 7 full days added to the cost of shipping. Port fees, dock workers, and their equipment accounted for 60 to 75% of the cost of shipping. So by the time a product reached our shelves, its price would have to be raised an average 12% to make up for it. But everything changed with the container. Companies realized they weren't in the business of shipping bananas or cars or phones. They were in the business of shipping. What's inside the box shouldn't matter. Their job is generic, efficient transportation. In fact, today, crew members don't even know most of what they're carrying. If shipping companies could take everything and put it in a single-sized box, they could turn thousands of individual problems into just one. How to move a known object from one place to another.
Passed around those little photos, but this is, after the Steel Navigator, I went back to school for 6 months, and then I went as deck cadet on another ship in 1964. This was this ship, the ones you see pictures of, those were all built around 1944, so they were all almost 20 years old. They were used in World War II, but this ship was built in 1964. I made the maiden voyages number 1, 2, and 3 as a deck cadet, and there were 6 of these ships built by McCormick Lines in Mississippi, and $6 million each. I don't think you could build a tugboat today for $6 million, but they were 24-knot cargo liners, and McCormick had a run from New York to North Europe. So this ship made a turnaround in 35 days from New York. It left New York in 6.5 days. We were in Rotterdam. The next day we were in Antwerp. The next day we were in Oslo. Next day Gothenburg. And after that Copenhagen. And then we would go back to Antwerp and Rotterdam and load more cargo coming back to the U.S. But what's unique here, as opposed to the older vessels, on deck, this is the beginning of containerization. This ship was built in 1964, in about 8 years basically was obsolete. Brand new ship, bridge control, 19,000 shaft horsepower. It burned a barrel of oil a mile. Okay, and of course in the 1970s it really became obsolete because oil got very, very expensive. So we would burn 600 barrels of oil a day on our transatlantic run. So if oil hit $100 a barrel, you can figure out, what it cost per day to, just to run that ship. So it was a 2-boiler ship, a steamship, and if we cut one boiler out and ran off of one boiler, it would do about 19 knots and save half the fuel. But anyway, this was a very interesting vessel. I made, as I said, the maiden voyage was to Europe. And every port we showed that they had cocktail parties and would show them all the shippers. And the reason McCormick built 6 was that, and I said 35-day turnaround and then 7 days on the coast, was every Friday night from New York they had a sailing. And this is called a liner service. So if you had a product you wanted to get to Europe in a week, you could put it on this ship, get it down to the docks on Friday, and get it on the ship by Friday night. But this ship required shoring, carpenters, labor. And so we could spend 12 hours waiting for the captain to sometimes go and say, okay, we can sail, because if he wouldn't like the way the cargo was secured, we would not leave port. And so that, this is a beautiful ship. I enjoyed it, and believe it or not, my first job when I graduated from the Merchant Marine Academy was on this ship. As I said, I had been cadet there, and the captain knew I was graduating, and he requested that the academy, if possible, give me a job on the ship. And so I always jokingly tell people I graduated first in my class, not academically, but my class graduated on Monday, but the Friday before that I was on this ship sailing across the North Atlantic.
Was that a cargo liner that carried passengers too?
All of these ships at the time had a deck for passengers, and the limitation was 12, because after you got over 12, by international law, you had to carry a nurse. And then after so many above that, you had to carry a doctor. So what we would get, because we were on this beautiful run to North Europe, in the summertime or fall or spring, a lot of teachers and professors would go. It was a cheap way to get to Europe, see Europe. As I said, every day we were in a different port, and sometimes they would skip. They'd hire a car or something and meet us in the next port, because only hours away. You can get from Antwerp to Rotterdam in an hour by car, but it took us 6 hours by ship to go outside and around. But it was a whole lifestyle. When we tied up in Antwerp, we were right in the city. We tied up in Rotterdam, we were right in the city. Within a few short years, we were out in the boonies, because containerization was taken over, so these ships started carrying boxes. In fact, 6 months after I was on the ship, we went to Maryland Dry Dock in Baltimore, and we converted the holes in 3 and 4 to cells. So what that meant was they could put the 40-foot container in a cell and not worry about it flipping over, because they were rails for the container to sit upright. And we would stack them sometimes about 3 high on deck. But the problem was it had all these booms and other things to worry about. And then later on, probably, I think it must have been in the 80s, they actually stretched the ship. They jumboized it, and they made 2 more holes in the center so it could carry more containers. Now, I don't want to bore you with too much in naval architecture, but there's this thing called block coefficient. Okay, and what that means, if you have a block of wood, that's considered 100%. And as the ship gets finer and finer in the water, like this is very fine and there's fine back here, the block coefficient changes. So high-speed vessels such as this one and warships and others have a different block coefficient. So ideally, for storing containers like a barge, you could stack them all up because there's no finesse to the ends. And so when you put a midsection in that's square, basically, or a rectangle, you get more carrying capacity. How many of you own a sailboat? Okay, if you add 6 feet to a sailboat, where do you add it? Right in the middle, right? So your cabin is much bigger because the bow and the stern are still the same, but you get a lot more room. So the same thing when they jumboize a ship, they get a lot more storage capacity because it's almost a square or a rectangle. Trial and error. Here again, as I said, I was in the beginning when they started trying to put containers on a great bulk ship. Let me go back a little bit. Sealand was the first ship, had the first containers fully containerized. Malcolm McLean put containers on the deck of a T-tube tanker because that's the way containers were going to be going. As somebody asked earlier, you could carry containers on deck and not have any below deck because as long as you had your stability correct, you were fine. So Malcolm McLean's first ships ran from New York to Texas, Texas to New York. They were 35-foot containers. Okay, so Sealand was the name of the game. And then Because also, think back to the 50s, those of you who were driving or remember driving with mom and dad, American highways were horrible in the 50s. It was only when Eisenhower was president that he created the interstate highway system. So that put a real crimp in some of this, but because Malcolm had figured everyone was stuck on the highway somewhere around Route 1, and there were all these expressways for trucks, and then the trucking business thrived when they built the interstate highway system and took some of the business from Sealand. So Sealand thought, what better way, you can't build a highway across the ocean, so he opened up his service to Europe and eventually to Asia, and he started taking his boxes all the way across the ocean. But it started as what we call a coastwise trade. But, as you saw in the video, size was the problem. No one had one standard container. As I said, Malcolm McLean had decided a 35-foot box for his business, and that was the standard for Sealand. And all their ships were built with cells for 35-foot containers. The gantry cranes were for 35-foot containers. And then the international consortium decided, we don't like 35-foot containers, we like 40-foot containers or 20-foot containers. So the international standard was set at 20 feet and 40 feet. So that kind of put a little crimp in Sealand's business, but they eventually evolved and they built their new ships to have 40-foot containers. Even today, the TEU is a 20-foot equivalent unit. So they measure containers by 20 feet, not 40 feet, but a 40-foot container is a 2 TEU unit. So when they add up how many containers on a ship, you have to be careful. It may not be as many as they say because they're measuring it in 20-foot units. Going back to problems. So this ship, we had containers at 3 and 4 hatch stowed fore and aft. They're 40 feet long. Right, the hatches were a little bit over 40 feet. They could put them out. But if you put containers on number 2 hatch, they didn't fit because it wasn't 40 feet. So they put the boxes thwartship, meaning the chassis went thwartship, not fore and aft. And by that, let's just say this is the bow, this is the stern. You put your box this way. Well, when you start rolling 40 degrees in the North Atlantic in wintertime, all of the cargo that's in that box starts to move. And we would roll, and the doors of the container would fly open, over the side it would go. And so the other times they had cargo booms here, so they devised to pick up these containers using spreaders and ship's gear. And every once in a while, the spreader wasn't exactly right, or something would happen. They'd pick up the container and it would fold in the middle. So these shipping lines that all try to transition piecemeal into containerization had problems. One time we picked up a container, when I say we, the longshoremen would pick up a container, they were swinging it over the side of the ship, and all of a sudden somebody didn't check the weight on the container, and all the cargo fell through the bottom. And it happened to be over the top of containers that were already in the ship, and it crashed right down through the containers in the lower hull. So these are problems that Sealand had, but because Sealand were strictly container vessels, and they used the proper equipment, they did not have most of those problems. So Malcolm was way ahead of everyone else. The other problem was almost all the shipping companies in the world had great bulk ships, and they had to invest a lot of money in container ships, and they were very reluctant. But eventually they saw the light, and they made the transition. Just have to check my notes a little bit on this. Oh, the other thing is, and you'll see a little bit on the next video, how do they keep track of these containers? Well, a lot of things happen. The computer and barcodes. So when a container would come into a terminal, the barcode would be read, and they would know where to stack it, and then the computer would get it, and they would know how to load the ship or unload the ship. And most of the containers had seals on them because the customs had to check what was in the container, put a seal on it, and in most cases they didn't actually lock it, it just had a seal. And I think I'll show you the next video. Does anyone have any questions right now before we get any further along?